Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in only 6 weeks. He laughed over it, he cried over it, and the publication of it mattered so much to him that he spent a lot of his own money on it. Today, we intimately associate Dickens with Christmas in our minds because of this story. Let me share with you the remarkable story of the life of Charles Dickens, and let's discuss one of the most famous Christmas stories in the world.
Charles John Huffam Dickens was born on the 7th of February 1812 in a fairly small house in Portsmouth, which you can still visit today. It's a wonderful Dickens museum. His father was John Dickens, and he worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, and of course Portsmouth was a very important base for the Navy. Dickens's mother was Elizabeth Barrow, and her father had been accused of embezzling money just after the Dickens couple got married. So financial difficulties were there even before young Charles was born. Now, in 1814, the family moved to London. Then, in 1817, they moved to another dockside town, a place called Chatham. There, young Charles had a nursemaid who liked to tell the little boy extremely ghoulish stories. A particular favourite was about a man who used to eat his wives when they were cooked in pies. Now, young Charles seems to have had a happy time at Chatham, and just across the Medway was the cathedral city of Rochester. He loved reading, he had siblings, he adored puppet shows and the theatre if ever he could get to it. But then family finances got bad, and they had to move to a worse house. One day, on a walk with his father in the countryside near to Chatham, the young boy saw the house of Gad's Hill. Perhaps he was attracted by the cupola, the rather unusual cupola on the top of the house, and he looked at it, and his father said to him, "Maybe, Charles, if you work very hard, one day you will own a house like that one." Dickens never forgot these things that happened to him in his childhood, and eventually he owned that very house, Gad's Hill House. Now, Rochester, across the river from Chatham, was a very important place to young Dickens, and it's there that he actually sets the start of his first novel, The Pickwick Papers, and also his last and unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Mr. Pickwick, before breakfast, climbs up the tower to the top of the castle and describes Rochester as a very fine town indeed. And many of the different buildings around the town are used in Dickens's fiction, such as the magnificent Eastgate House, which appears in both the Pickwick Papers and Edwin Drood. So it was a very important place to young Charles Dickens because he was happy there. But in 1822 things got worse. John Dickens was hopeless with money. He was transferred to London, and very soon the family finances were bad again. The family lived in a house in Bayham Street in London, but that house has not survived. Now, the finances got so bad that young Charles, who was a very ambitious boy, was taken out of school. He later commented, "What would I have given, if I had had anything to give, to have been sent back to any other school, to have been taught something anywhere?" The young boy loved to read, particularly the 18th century novelists like Sterne and Smollett and Henry Fielding. Those books got sold to pay the family debts, and young Charles vowed that one day he would buy back every single one of those books. Now, he began to wander around London and soon came to know its streets incredibly well. It was said in later life that Dickens could put cabmen right when it came to directions. He knew the geography of London incredibly well. Tradesmen began knocking on the door to collect debts. Dickens describes a lot of this happening in his great novel David Copperfield, and Mr. Micawber, it is thought, was based on Dickens's own father. Dickens once commented that the only thing he'd ever been left in life was relations, and he found his relations very expensive to look after. But then things got even worse. 2 days after he turned 12, Charles was sent to work at a boot blacking factory. In those days, gentlemen all wore very high black boots, and those boots needed to be black, using nugget, as we would say today. And the job that Charles had was pasting labels onto the blacking pots, and he had to sit by a window where the light was good in order that he could do this job properly. And he hated the fact that he was sitting there on display to passers-by, and he felt very, very ashamed of this menial work. There were long hours from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., 6 shillings per week in payment, and 6 days a week of work, so it was certainly not an easy job. There was a boy employed there whose name was Bob Fagin, and Dickens tucked that surname away, and it would emerge later in his fiction. The time in the blacking factory had a deeply traumatic effect on him. He never talked about it in later life, even to members of his family. The one person that he told was his future biographer and his very good friend John Forster. He was thinking that things couldn't get much worse, and then they did. His father was arrested for debt, and the whole family, except for Charles, were moved off to live in the Marshalsea prison. It seems very strange to us today that a man arrested for debt should be plonked into prison where he is unable to do any work in order to pay off that debt. And because his family could not afford any other sort of accommodation, they would move into the Marshalsea as well. They were allowed to come and go out and buy food, go out and find work or whatever. And so that is what happened to the Dickens family. Now, after 3 months, his father was eventually helped by a friend, and the family was able to leave the prison. And today a plaque records the Dickens connection with the spot where the Marshalsea once stood. The Marshalsea is superbly used in his novel Little Dorrit, where many members of the Dorrit family are living in the prison. I think that Dickens would later recreate this prison experience and the terrible 20 weeks that he spent in the blacking factory in a host of the suffering children that you find in his novels. He felt tremendous sympathy for young children who were at the mercy of bullying school teachers or employers or step-parents, and who were harshly treated by society. Now, Dickens was able to go back to school for the next years, and then when he left school, he knew that he needed to do something to earn a living. He went to work in a law office, and he absolutely hated it. After 18 months, he left, but he created many memorable lawyers in his books, particularly, of course, in his great novel Bleak House, which is a novel that centres on the law. That book has a fabulously memorable character named Mr. Vholes, who is described by Dickens as a sallow man with pinched lips that looked as if they were cold, a red eruption here and there upon his face, tall and thin, about 50 years of age, high-shouldered and stooping. And later we hear Mr. Vholes secretly picked at one of the red pimples on his yellow face with his black glove. Dickens then thought about becoming an actor. He had always adored the stage, but he ended up missing the planned audition through ill health, and so he began working as a reporter instead. He became a very good parliamentary reporter. He learned shorthand, he taught it to himself, and he earned good money. We have the earliest picture of the young Charles Dickens that was actually painted by his aunt, showing a young man who I think already at this age is showing signs of dandyism. Dickens was always very particular about his clothes and the image that he was presenting to posterity. Now, he began to find a particular reason for being extra cautious about his clothes because he had met a young girl and fallen in love. Her name was Maria Beadnell. Maria kept Charles dangling for years, and eventually she dropped him. She felt that maybe he wasn't a good marital prospect, and she married another man. Dickens was very heartbroken when Maria dumped him, but later on Maria ended up coming back in a most interesting way into his life. She sent him a letter once Dickens had become an extremely famous author and her own husband had died, and she reminded him of past times and told him that she still had very fond memories of him. Dickens's heart went into a state of great flutter when he saw her handwriting on the envelope, and he rather naughtily made an arrangement for her to come to the house when he knew his wife would be away. Now, Maria tried to warn him that many, many years had gone by and that she had changed a little bit in the course of this time. Dickens swore that she could never have changed. She was still the lovely young girl that he had been so deeply in love with, and he worked himself up into a state of incredible excitement at the prospect of seeing his beloved Maria again. She arrived, and he was absolutely horrified. She had become very large. Probably the poor woman was very nervous at meeting an old boyfriend who had become so famous since she'd last seen him, and she could barely stop talking. And I think Dickens was angry with Maria for changing, very unfairly in my view, and he decided to take his literary revenge by putting aspects of her character into two of the characters in his novel Little Dorrit. One of my very favourite characters in that novel is a woman called Mrs. Merdle. Now, Dickens doesn't often talk about different parts of female anatomy, but he does with Mrs. Merdle, because Mrs. Merdle has an extremely impressive bosom. Dickens describes it brilliantly. It was not a bosom to repose upon, but it was a capital bosom to hang jewels upon, and Mr. Merdle had bought it for the purpose. Like all his other speculations, it was sound and successful. The bosom, moving in society with the jewels displayed upon it, attracted general admiration. The other character in the same novel, who I think owes something to Maria Beadnell, or Maria Winter, as she had become, is the character Flora Finching. She's the past girlfriend of the hero of the novel, and when she meets up with him again, she talks far too much, and she has become rather foolish. So I think that Maria Beadnell made quite a mistake at trying to meet up with Charles Dickens once again. But to go back to when Dickens was a young man, he had been dropped by Maria, and he was starting to write. He began to contribute to magazines, and then he wrote his work Sketches by Boz, which was published in 1834, a collection of sketches under the pseudonym Boz, which he dropped fairly quickly, but it did remain a beloved nickname for Dickens throughout the rest of his writing life. The sketches did well and got him noticed, so his writing career very quickly got off to a good start. He then met a young girl called Catherine Hogarth. She came from a Scottish family. Her father had actually known the great Sir Walter Scott, and he began to court Catherine, and when a publisher asked him if he could possibly write a novel in instalments, Dickens felt that that would be enough on which the couple could marry. So they got married in 1836, and almost at the same time he began the Pickwick Papers, or the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club. Now, this book proved to be an extraordinary success, especially when a character called Sam Weller appeared, and the novel made Dickens famous almost overnight. The first few serial instalments of the book were not so popular, but Sam Weller was introduced into the novel several chapters in, and he's a Cockney, and he spoke like so many of the Londoners who were reading the novel, and they had never really encountered a character like themselves in fiction before, and they were enchanted. People fell in love with Sam Weller and rushed around trying to buy up the early instalments of the novel so that they could find out what had happened from the beginning. And what followed really was a Pickwick Papers mania. You could buy Pickwick prints and Pickwick clothing and Pickwick playing cards, and it really took off, and as I say, by the time the novel had finished appearing in its serial instalments, Dickens was an incredibly famous man. The early years of the Dickens marriage were happy, and Catherine had her young sister, a girl named Mary Hogarth, come to live with them. Poor Catherine. I do feel very sorry for Catherine Dickens. She had 11 children over the years of the marriage, so she was very, very frequently pregnant. Now, suddenly, in 1837, only a year after they had married, there was a family tragedy. Dickens had been out to the theatre with the two women, his wife and her sister Mary. He was very fond of 17-year-old Mary. They came home from the theatre, and Mary complained about not feeling well, set off upstairs to bed, and suddenly collapsed, and within a couple of hours she was dead. Dickens's reaction was very over the top. He actually said he wanted to be buried in the same grave as Mary when he died, and he was rather upset when one of her brothers died before him and got the place next to Mary. He kept her ring on his finger for the rest of his life, and this was the only time he was ever late with one of his serial instalments. Catherine's other sister, Georgina, came to live with them, and she would end up staying for the rest of her life, living with the Dickens family. But I think that the death of young Mary Hogarth, who was only 17 and of course pretty and virginal, would greatly influence the many 17-year-old pretty and virginal heroines that you find in Dickens's novels. Heroines like Florence Dombey, Rose Maylie or Kate Nickleby, and you find these girls again and again in his works. Now, Dickens worked incredibly hard over these next years. He was absolutely determined never to be poor again. As the children kept coming, there were big family expenses, but he worked incredibly hard, he paid his debts, he was very definite that he was not going to end up like his father. And of course, the Pickwick Papers, being such a success, did bring in lots of money. Dickens was good at writing serials, and this was a very popular form of publishing in the middle of the 19th century. He was very good at ending an instalment on some sort of cliffhanger, making his readers long to get the next instalment as soon as it came out, and he was also quite a good businessman when it came to negotiating his contracts. He was a very good publicist. His next book was Oliver Twist, another very memorable novel. And this book highlighted the poor law reforms that had been taking place in Britain in recent times. Dickens became a great social campaigner, and he realized that when he had young Oliver Twist holding out his bowl and saying, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" that this could help bring about enormous social change. Dickens was asked later in his life if he would be interested in standing for Parliament, but he felt that he could do far more good through his novels than he ever could as a politician. I love the characters Mr. Bumble and Mrs. Corney in Oliver Twist. I find the middle-aged characters often far more interesting than the young, virginal and romantic ones. Mrs. Corney is a widow. She's quite keen to get married to Mr. Bumble, but she wants to know how much he is worth. He's rather interested in Mrs. Corney physically, but he's unwilling to commit himself until he knows what she is worth. And it's one of Dickens's great comic scenes when the two of them manoeuvre around each other in a fabulous mixture of financial greed and sexual lust. Dickens handles such characters brilliantly. So Dickens had his portrait painted, showing himself as a very successful man. This one was done by his friend Daniel Maclise, a very fine artist. The family had moved to Doughty Street in Bloomsbury, now another wonderful Dickens museum. It was in this house that his sister-in-law Mary died. Dickens was now being asked to go out more and more into society, and as time went on he went without his wife. When she was pregnant, it was very hard for her to accompany him. He continued writing, and more wonderful books appeared over the years. In 1839, Nicholas Nickleby. Dickens travelled up to Yorkshire to investigate some of the dreadful schools that he had heard about. He did this anonymously, and within just a few years of him publishing Nicholas Nickleby, all of those terrible institutions had closed down. In 1841 he published The Old Curiosity Shop, and as his readers made their way through the various instalments, they became more and more worried that little Nell might die. Now, there are some rather amusing stories about Little Nell. When the boat carrying the latest instalments of the Old Curiosity Shop was approaching the harbour in Boston, hundreds of people turned up to line the harbour to find out if Little Nell lived or died. Somebody called out from the boat, "Little Nell dies," and there was mass grieving amongst the crowd, with gentlemen sobbing into their handkerchiefs and ladies needing their smelling salts to revive them. In Dickens's time, everyone would have known somebody who had lost a young child. Child mortality was very high. But as time went on, Dickens's rather sentimental, overblown death scenes of young children do come to seem perhaps a little bit less suited to modern taste. In fact, only 50 years after the Old Curiosity Shop came out, Oscar Wilde was able to say, "It is impossible to read the death of Little Nell without laughing." In 1841, Dickens also published his historical novel, Barnaby Rudge. It's not one of his most successful books, although the descriptions of the Gordon riots are absolutely superb. In 1842, he travelled to America to give readings and public talks. He didn't really want to go, and he was very angry with the Americans because there was no proper copyright law in place at that time, and so all of his novels were pirated in America, and he earned no money whatsoever from the thousands and thousands of copies of his books sold in that country. So as he travelled around America with his wife Catherine, she had to leave small children at home in England with her sister, he spoke out in favour of getting better copyright laws in place. In 1843, he dashed off a story very quickly in time for Christmas, and this was his great story, A Christmas Carol. It was a phenomenal success. Dickens ended up writing 5 Christmas stories altogether, but none of them were ever as beloved as A Christmas Carol. In 1844, he published Martin Chuzzlewit. He sent his character Martin off to America, so he made some use of his American experiences in that novel. Again, not one of his most successful novels, but it does have 2 immortal characters in Mrs. Gamp, whose teapot is usually full of gin, and now today we have a type of umbrella named for Mrs. Gamp, and then his very hypocritical character, Mr. Pecksmith. In 1848, he published Dombey and Son, his novel about the disruption caused in England with the coming of the railways. Again, fascinating descriptions of the changes to the English landscape. At the time of Dickens's birth, the fastest a man could travel was on the back of a horse, but suddenly these iron horses were whisking people all over the English landscape, and Dickens in his later years would make full use of trains whenever he travelled. In 1850, he published his most autobiographical novel, David Copperfield. He even used his own initials for the hero, but he reversed them. And many of his own experiences went into that novel. When David falls in love with Dora, one of the silliest women in the whole of literature, it reflects Dickens's own passion for Maria Beadnell. David learns shorthand, and many of the things that happen to David in the novel are reflections of Dickens's own experiences, and it is one of his greatest works. I recommend so strongly trying to find Dickens's novels on audio version. It's fabulous to listen to them being well read by an English actor. Martin Jarvis does a fabulous reading of David Copperfield, and Dickens really wrote his books to be read aloud. He would have greatly approved of good audio versions of his novels. In 1853, Dickens brought out Bleak House. Now, this is almost 1 book a year, and these are not small novels. Bleak House is my own personal favourite. I think it is his great masterpiece, beginning with the London fogs creeping through the city, reflecting, of course, the fog in the law courts, and with some truly memorable characters, from little Miss Flight with her collection of birds, to the fabulous Mr. Guppy, who goes courting Esther Summerson. So many marvellous characters in that great novel. And Dickens juggles all these different plot lines, all these different groups of characters, and towards the end he pulls on the strings and he brings them all in together, showing how they are interlinked. It is a truly stunning novel. I'm less fond of his 1854 novel, Hard Times, set in an industrial city in the north of England. It is one of the great industrial novels of the era. Elizabeth Gaskell, who Dickens knew, was of course also writing industrial novels. But I don't feel that it's a particularly successful book. It's not one that I go back to reread. In 1857 he published Little Dorrit, a brilliant novel, the descriptions of the Marshalsea, the travels that take place with the Dorrits throughout Europe, the love that Amy Dorrit feels for Arthur Clennam, and of course Arthur Clennam's love for another woman at the beginning, when he has to accept that she is not going to love him back. There's one of Dickens's most moving scenes as Arthur breaks up the flowers she has given him and drops the petals into the river and watches them float away. In 1859 we get A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Dickens was so brilliant at opening lines. That, of course, is his historical novel set in the time of the French Revolution. And who can ever forget Sidney Carton with his "It is a far, far better thing I do," etc., as he mounts those steps to the guillotine. In 1861, another brilliant novel with Great Expectations, which begins in the area where Dickens spent so much of his boyhood, near to Chatham and Rochester. There's a little graveyard in a place called Cooling, with all the graves that Dickens describes as the stone lozenge-like graves of Pip's brothers and sisters, and Magwitch rears up from behind a tombstone and terrifies poor little Pip. Again, some marvellous characters. There's, of course, Miss Havisham, there's the lawyer, Mr. Jaggers, and there's Pip himself and his lovely friend, Herbert Pocket, I think one of Dickens's nicest young men. Then there was a little bit of a gap. Great Expectations came out in 1861, and the next novel was 1865, and that was Our Mutual Friend, another fabulous book. And of course all of these novels have been filmed, and Dickens translates, I think, very well indeed to film. By this time the Dickens family was living in a house in Devonshire Terrace, a large house because they were a large family. Dickens was very fussy about the arrangement of the furniture, and if anything was out of place he would line it up properly and rearrange, and I think he was becoming rather difficult to live with. The Dickens family travelled a lot. They often popped over to Europe. Dickens was very fond of France and Italy. And as time went on, Dickens was beginning to give more and more public readings. He had always adored the theatre, producing and acting. And the public readings exhausted him. In fact, as time went on, he had to have a doctor waiting in the wings because his pulse went up to an alarming rate and he needed to be revived by the doctor when he came off the stage. He was particularly fond of reading an adapted version of Bill Sykes's Murder of Nancy, and that sent his pulse skyrocketing and really became quite dangerous for Dickens to read. He had a special desk for his readings, and you can see this desk today in the Dickens Museum in Doughty Street. But it was the theatre that introduced him to a delightful young lady who was 17 years of age. Her name was Ellen Ternan, and she came from an acting family. Dickens began a relationship with Ellen Ternan. Now, biographers have argued about whether she was his mistress or whether he was just very good friends with her. I personally don't think that a man in his 50s keeps a 17-year-old girl in his life completely secret from everyone who knows him, goes to visit her 2 or 3 times a week, and even travels with her, if he's only going to be sitting and sipping tea with her. I think it's very definite that Ellen Ternan was his mistress. Claire Tomalin, in her fabulous book The Invisible Woman, even argues that Ellen Ternan had Dickens's child, but the baby died. He did his very best to keep Ellen Ternan secret from everybody, but it seems that a present he had meant to buy for her got delivered to his wife Catherine by mistake. And things were becoming very strained indeed in the Dickens marriage. And Dickens, I think, went through a very bad midlife crisis. He treated Catherine very cruelly. He even had a wall erected down the middle of their bedroom so that he would be on one side and she on the other. And in 1858 he finally separated from her. He needed to keep this quiet because in his fiction he was the great sort of arbiter of home and family, and had his public known that he had a young mistress and he had kicked his wife out, it would not have helped the sales of his books. Catherine was sent to live in another house. She was really pretty much cut off access from most of her children. She was allowed to take the youngest with her. He did pay her an allowance, and he expected her to keep her mouth shut. Many of Dickens's good friends told him he was behaving madly, and he should not be treating his devoted wife like this, and Dickens would often end a friendship if he felt that the friends were taking Catherine's side and not his. Poor Catherine did remain very dignified, and she did remain silent, but on her own death she left the love letters that he had written her to the British Museum. She said, "I want the world to know he loved me once." I've always felt very sorry for Catherine Dickens. Dickens by this time had purchased Gad's Hill, and he would spend more and more of his time at Gad's Hill, making trips into London when he needed to do so for work. He was very busy as an editor. He edited a publication called Household Words and later one called All the Year Round, and he was very good at finding contributors. Wilkie Collins, a good friend of his, often contributed, and so did Elizabeth Gaskell, though sometimes she was late with her contributions, and this drove Dickens crazy. He once said, Mrs. Gaskell, oh, if I were her husband, how I would beat her." So one senses his frustration with lateness in that remark. There were many famous visitors who came to Gad's Hill. Hans Christian Andersen came and definitely overstayed his welcome. In fact, when the Danish writer left, they carved into the window of the room with a diamond cutter, "Hans Christian Andersen slept in this room for 5 weeks, which seemed to the family ages." Andersen's English was not very good, and Dickens and his wife were on the verge of separation, so the atmosphere was very strained, and Dickens found Hans Christian Andersen a bony bore and was delighted when finally he went away. Now, to get money for his growing family and to finance careers for his sons, Dickens did more and more of his public readings, and these definitely damaged his health. Photographs of him in his early 50s show him looking much older than that, and a lot of strain on his face. He was then involved in something called the Staplehurst Railway disaster. He was actually travelling with Ellen Ternan and her mother when the train crashed, and he had to help injured and dying people. He had to climb back into the carriage in order to rescue the manuscript on which he had been working, and he was very traumatised by this dreadful railway accident, and his writing rate really slowed after the Staplehurst disaster. His health was getting worse. He was bleeding internally. His pulse rate would be as high as 112 after some of his readings, and generally the strain was beginning to tell. Dickens's health was definitely suffering. He died, probably from a stroke, at Gad's Hill on the 9th of June 1870 at the age of only 58. Claire Tomalin argues that perhaps he actually died in the arms of his mistress Ellen and had to be very quickly brought back to Gad's Hill in order to be seen to die in respectable circumstances. He had wanted to be quietly buried in the moated graveyard around Rochester Castle, but it was felt by the nation that Dickens was far too famous for burial in a fairly small cathedral city, so he was buried in Westminster Abbey. The coffin of Charles Dickens was left open there for a few days, and thousands of his devoted readers filed past, threw flowers in, and the whole of the country went into national mourning. Paintings have been done showing the chair, the empty chair, the chair in which Dickens sat at his desk where he created so many of his characters. And there's also an unfinished one, with many of the fabulous characters that he created on the wall around the desk and chair. And there are so many of his memorable characters. I'm very fond of Mrs. Pipchin in Dombey, who's magnificently described by Dickens as wearing black of such a lustreless, deep, dead, sombre shade that gas itself couldn't light her up after dark. Think of Fagin from Oliver Twist, Wackford Squeers, that wonderfully named character from Nicholas Nickleby, Sidney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities, Mr. Guppy from Bleak House, and a host more. Dickens created hundreds of memorable characters in his wonderful novels. Dickens, on the very last morning of his life, was working on the mystery of Edwin Drood. He went out to write in a little Swiss chalet that had been a present to him, which stood in the grounds of Gad's Hill. Today it's actually in the city of Rochester, next to Eastgate House. And you can see the Swiss chalet there today. But he was working on Edwin Drood. It's a mystery novel. We don't really quite know where it was going to go because Dickens never completed that novel. Some critics have said it's the greatest mystery of all time because it will always remain a mystery. Statues have been put up of Charles Dickens. There's a statue of Dickens with Little Nell in Philadelphia. On the bicentenary, a statue of Dickens was put up in his birthplace in Portsmouth, and there's a fabulous Charles Dickens statue in Sydney. And I've always enjoyed the history of this particular statue. It was put up a long time ago when a whole lot of statues were bought to be put in various places in Sydney's Centennial Park. And then about 60 or so years ago, it's thought some students were getting up to hijinks in the park one evening, and the head of the statue was smashed to bits. The statue was taken away, and it was intended that marble would be ordered and it would be repaired, but time went by and nobody was pushing for it and nothing happened. I'm a member of the New South Wales Dickens Society, and somebody in the group asked one day what had actually happened to the statue. So a little thing was put into the newspaper, and that resulted in some anonymous telephone calls, and eventually the statue, still headless, was located at the Blue Mountains, a couple of hours' drive from Sydney. The Sydney Park authorities decided they would like to have the statue back, so it was brought back into Sydney. Marble was ordered and a sculptor was put to work. And on Dickens's 199th birthday, the statue, with new head attached, was unveiled in Centennial Park. And the New South Wales Dickens Society has had many get-togethers in the park by the statue, celebrating Charles Dickens's birthday every February. So it's really great to have it back on Dickens Drive in the park. Although Dickens himself famously said that he didn't really ever want statues of himself to be erected. So Dickens was a truly great writer who shaped so much of 19th century fiction and had such an incredible influence on writers who came afterwards. But one of my great favourites is A Christmas Carol, so let's have a look at that wonderful work now. A Christmas Carol is not just a short novel, it's a phenomenon. It's a story that is profound, archetypal, and touches very deeply our longing for second chances, the opportunity to correct past mistakes. A Christmas Carol is a story that makes us think and feel. The story, although it ends happily, has the catharsis of great tragedy. We go through Scrooge's ordeal with the three spirits, and we feel cleansed and purified by his reprieve at the end of the story. The great Victorian novelist William Makepeace Thackeray said of the tale, "It seems to me a national benefit, and to every man and woman who reads it, a personal kindness." A Christmas Carol was written while Dickens was working on Martin Chuzzlewit, a novel that had not been going particularly well, and he was feeling under some financial pressure. So he wrote A Christmas Story in order to try and improve his finances, and the carol took him 6 weeks to write. The tale developed a strange mastery over Dickens. He walked the streets at night thinking over the characters. He himself wept frequently as he wrote it. The story mattered so much to him that he actually paid for the production of it himself, and he was very fussy about how it looked. The cost to anyone wanting to purchase it was only 5 shillings, so the story was available to the masses, and Dickens in the end made almost no profit from this work that proved so incredibly popular. Now, at the time that Dickens was born, Christmas was not a very important major celebration. Queen Victoria came to the throne in the year 1837. Before that, Christmas was low-key, but her husband, Prince Albert, introduced the Christmas tree into England, and pictures were made of the royal family celebrating Christmas, and this made the festival much more popular. The very first Christmas card was produced in 1843, and the first Christmas cracker in the year 1848. So Dickens was tapping into a growing appreciation and enthusiasm for celebrating Christmas. Now, Dickens was himself worried about money as he was writing this story, and he examines in the story people's attitudes to wealth. He doesn't condemn people becoming rich like Scrooge, but he does condemn it when they will not share their money. Scrooge counts over his money, economizes for absolutely no reason, and his personality has become warped by his riches. At the end, he no longer cares about saving the money. He gives Bob a pay rise, and he buys the biggest turkey on the market. It's also a story about selfishness. Now, the novel on which he was working, Martin Chuzzlewit, was also about greed and selfishness. These were things that were very much in Dickens's mind at that time. And A Christmas Carol is in many ways a condensed version of those same themes that were in Martin Chuzzlewit. The rich live comfortably, the poor lead desperate lives. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly," he says. But Dickens is arguing that the poor were everybody's business. It is also, of course, a religious story. Dickens comments, "Christmas comes but once a year," but he wants the spirit of Christmas and the spirit of generosity to last all the year through. He wants people to remember the principles of Christianity. He himself, although born Anglican, often attended the Unitarian Church, and the Unitarians believed in very practical religion. You didn't just sit in church on Sundays and think about good deeds, you actually went out during the week and performed them. So the carol evokes religious spirit and religious ideals. Dickens even calls the various chapters in the work staves. Now, a stave is a set of musical lines holding together one part of the music. So the use of this word staves implies that the church should be holding society together. And of course, the word carol is also a very religious one. There's no doubt that the story did have a very good effect on those who read it, and charitable donations went up considerably at this time as a result of what Dickens had written. Dickens also looks at the poverty of his city, and of course his own childhood had given him a great awareness of what it was like to be poor in London. The three spirits or ghosts take Scrooge to see poor children, people who work hard but still cannot make their way, people burdened by debt, people who are starving, and people who are cold. Bob Cratchit earns a pittance and is half frozen when he goes to work. And Scrooge mentions the workhouses and says, oh, people can always go to the workhouses, but they were dreaded by the populace of Victorian Britain. Couples were split up, the conditions were dreadful, and Dickens, of course, shows life in the workhouse in some of his other novels. So the workhouse was hardly a viable alternative. A Christmas Carol is also a fabulous picture of London. We see the Cratchits' little home in Camden Town, where Dickens himself had once lived. We see the nephew Fred's home. We see Mr. Fezziwig's warehouse. But we also sometimes go out of the city with Scrooge and the spirits to see where Scrooge's life began, the village and the schoolhouse. And Dickens uses very powerful images to evoke the city of London and what life is like for many people in Victorian Britain. Fires, or the lack of them, doors through which one must pass, the chains that are linked to Jacob Marley and the ghosts, images of food and whether one has enough or not, money and cold, because Christmas was, of course, in the middle of winter. He has given us one of his most memorable characters in A Christmas Carol, with the fabulously named Ebenezer Scrooge. If you look up Scrooge in the dictionary, you will see that the word defines a miser. And with its connotations of scrounging and squeezing, I think Scrooge has been quite superbly named by Dickens. He, of course, is a moneylender. But it was also made clear in the course of the story that Scrooge himself was an abused child, and he's lacking any sort of love in his life. So let's have a look at Scrooge at the very beginning of A Christmas Carol. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of a strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said, "Bah!" again, and followed it up with, "Humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older, but not now a richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen a month presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." So there we see Scrooge very much in a non-Christmas mood. But each ghost teaches Scrooge different lessons. He goes through various rites of passage marked by different doors and different thresholds, and he goes back into his past, he sees Christmas present, and he is given a glimpse of what Christmas could be like in the future. Now, Dickens didn't believe in slow and gradual change in his characters. He liked drama and sudden epiphanies and alterations. And so, of course, we end up seeing a very, very changed Scrooge at the end. But he was early at the office next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?" "I am very sorry, sir," said Bob. "I am behind my time." "You are?" repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please." "Oh, it's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge, "I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore I am about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling to the people in the court for help and a straight waistcoat. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires, and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. The Cratchits and Tiny Tim teach us many lessons in A Christmas Carol. Poor Bob is the clerk. He's underpaid. He's a very, very good character. Never says an unkind word about Scrooge, his employer. He's religious. He's a good father. And he also has 6 children, although he's only 30. And some of those children are already quite grown up. So he must have married very young indeed. Dickens makes it very clear that Tiny Tim, the crippled boy, could die unless Scrooge steps in to help. There's a host of wonderful characters in A Christmas Carol, from the 3 ghosts to Jacob Marley, described as dead as a doornail and making that appearance in the very first parts of A Christmas Carol, and the Fezziwigs and the nephew Fred and his wife, so many fabulous characters. It's a bit hard to imagine Christmas without Dickens's A Christmas Carol. There's a famous story that when Dickens died, a little girl said, "And has Father Christmas died too?" Dickens and Christmas are inextricably linked in our minds and imaginations. I, for one, am forever grateful that he wrote his wonderful story, A Christmas Carol. So I'd like now to wish you a Merry Christmas, one and all.